Welcome to City Cinematheque, where the art and pleasure of the movies are the subject of serious discussion. I'm your host, Jerry Carlson, and I teach film studies at the City College of the City University of New York. Howard Hawks. What titles does that name evoke? The Big Sleep, Bringing Up Baby, His Girl Friday, Red River, all classics of the American cinema. But of course there was a younger Hawks, a man who was making very, very good films, but actually as far back as the silent era. Today we're going to be looking at one of his most important silent films, A Girl in Every Port. It's a film that sets a lot of the narrative patterns that we'll be able to detect in Hawks's later films. We'll be talking about that and a set of other things after today's screening. It's a pleasure to welcome to City Cinematheque today Professor Robert Sklar of New York University, a noted scholar of the American cinema. Now, take this opportunity to relish the boisterous humor and formal control of Howard Hawks's A Girl in Every Port. Welcome back to City Cinematheque. Well, you've seen early Hawks, but it's still very, very clearly, I think, to anyone who knows the later work of Howard Hawks, a Howard Hawks film. To talk about that and a whole set of other things, it's a pleasure to have, actually for the first time on City Cinematheque, so it's a bit of a pleasure to have someone here we've been trying to snag for a couple of years, Professor Robert Sklar of New York University. Bob is known to, I think, many of our spectators for much of his scholarly writing, including a classic of the relationship between American culture and American film, Movie Made America. And more recently, his overall history, film, the history, the international history of the medium. Welcome to City Cinematheque, Bob.
Pleasure to be here, Jerry.
I've made a lot in the last moment or so about this being a younger Howard Hawks. This is the late 20s, studio systems in place. Howard Hawks is not that old at this point. Tell us a little bit about Hawks in that kind of context.
Well, he started in the movies as a very, very young man. He was briefly in World War. He was born in 1896. He was briefly in World War I. He was friends with Victor Fleming, who became a director. He went out to Hollywood, and he must have been 20, 21, and started out writing and producing. He came from a wealthy background, and apparently he put money into an independent production company in the early 20s. And then he branched out from being a writer to being a director in the middle 20s. And he just started at Fox just before in the 26, 27, right. 28. And so this is launching him into a more prominent place as a director, certainly not the kind of prominence he was to have later, but he did some major work in the 20s.
Yeah, and that's one of the interesting things about the 20s is the way the system was set up. Now, mind you, this is true to some degree in the 30s and the 40s as well, but there was so much coming out through each of the studios, and since there were no NYUs or Columbias or city colleges or UCLAs, or whatever, as film schools, that this was really an apprentice world. How do you become a film director? You direct films. You work your way up and through the system. And what I find interesting about this late period is that, of the late silent period, is so many of the people that we think of as the masters of the classical Hollywood cinema, Wyler, Ford, Hawks, Wellman, and somebody who's going to come from England, Hitchcock, are all young men who are having a very significant body of work behind them by the time they cross over into sound film and become, masters of that. Let's talk a little bit about being a director in this epoch. What was the status of being a director? Now, in a certain sense, the director is God. Okay, it's an accepted part of American popular culture to talk about directors as the creative force behind the film, the organizing intelligence. There's a couple other ways to describe it, but that gets it. What about that concept in the 20s?
Well, it varies. And in Hawks's case, a French critic once said to me, as far as the auteur theory is concerned, there's only one auteur, and his name is Howard Hawks. So there's a provocative comment. And one reason that he made that remark is that Hawks usually, or certainly tried to, write the properties that he directed, so that he was in control of the original idea of the film, if not the full script. And that was the case certainly on A Girl in Every Port. It was his original story, which he then, other people wrote the treatment and wrote the intertitles and so on. And when sound came in, I mean, it's interesting to compare a silent film and a sound film by Hawks, because when sound came in, Hawks became notorious for having multiple scripts, or for rewriting, stopping the production and closing the set, and then sitting down with his actors and rewriting the script, so that he maintained control over what actually was going to happen in a way that infuriated often the producers or the studio heads. So it was a kind of guerrilla tactic on his part to be the man in control. In other cases, sometimes a producer, or excuse me, a director would be his own producer, which gave him some control. But often the director would show up on the set, and the script would be given to him, and they'd say, you know, we need 6 minutes a day, and he'd go out and shoot the script. And that was a different kind, certainly, of one thinks much more of a kind of the producer as auteur in those situations.
No, I think this point's well taken. The other thing has to do with the organization of the studio into really labor units, and the part of the genius of the system was that those units weren't supposed to, or didn't have to have, that much contact, that they worked sort of autonomously. So you have a script department, and it gets that product that is then taken into production, and people have a certain set of skills in doing that. Now, that doesn't mean that people don't meet in the commissary or like each other or want to work on projects together, but the system itself is not directly collaborative in that way, or it's collaborative under the umbrella, as you put it, of the producer who's coordinating those units.
And it's very variable in terms of casting, for example. Will the director have a role in casting? Often not in this period. The casting is also done by another department.
Right.
So,
No. Interesting points all. Now, for Hawks, there's also this relationship he had, and this will bring us back into the period as well. Because one of the things that's remarkable about Hawks's career is when we look back among the people he worked with and the people he maintained relationships of one kind or another, we're talking about a major American director by any standard who had some relationship with William Faulkner. He worked with Faulkner on a number of occasions as a scriptwriter, and of course he had a relationship with Hemingway as well. Let's talk a little bit about Hawks and the authority, you know, of an artist. What do you? It seems like very early on he had a very strong sense of himself as someone who had a stature alongside these people whom he admired, who, you know, obviously had a kind of literary celebrity as well.
Well, it comes down in some ways just to personality. I mean, there are many stories about Hawks as cold, icy, aloof. He, even in his photographs, he's in certain ways a kind of aristocrat. And
Can I stop you for just
sure.
one second? I tell you what I want to do, because you've just given such a wonderful description. What I want to do is point out on the wide shot that we have on the show that Howard Hawks himself has his aristocratic eye through the camera and looking over this show. So, Bob, sorry to have interrupted you, but I wanted that insert shot. Let's go back to Hawks, the aristocrat.
Well, I think that's part of. I mean, there are two things to say about Hawks in general, or there are many things to say, but one of them is the remarkable way in which his reputation never matched that of a number of other directors of his generation, Ford or Capra, or you could list 8 or 10 people, you know, even as late as the 50s, early 50s, Manny Farber is sort of treating him as a kind of underground filmmaker who's unappreciated. So that's one side of Hawks. On the other side, there's this figure who manages to get his way. There's a memo in the RKO files that I looked at years ago where they're Bringing Up Baby, and one of the producers is saying to the head of the studio, if he brings in the film on time and under budget or at budget, we're going to make money on this film. If he doesn't, we're going to lose our shirt.
Right.
And Hawks went ahead with Bringing Up Baby. It took 61 days to shoot. It was something like 60% over budget. It was $1.5 million when there was budgeted at $750,000, whatever, and it lost a lot of money. So he wanted to do what he wanted to do, and the fact that he got away with it,
right,
is remarkable.
Okay. Let's turn back to him also, and someone like Hemingway, because Hemingway is someone who has a particular image, and these are young men who had some of the same experience of a generation of World War I. What's the kind of relationship between the Hawksian narrative world or ethos and what we associate with Hemingway? Because I think that's relevant to this film, A Girl in Every Port.
Well, it's a very interesting issue because after Hemingway's death, and as some of the posthumous work got published, we begin to see that Hemingway's interest in gender was more complex than originally thought. And you think of Hemingway as kind of a macho figure, a man who spends more time with men in kind of male pursuits like hunting and fishing and war, and where women are creatures who get in the way of male friendship and so on and so forth. And there are many echoes of that in Hawks, of course. But later we see Hemingway, when we get these sort of later books, that he's thinking about sort of the ambiguities of gender in a way that is also even closer to Hawks, because Hawks is constantly playing with he's both, and sometimes he's celebrating, sometimes he's undermining sort of stereotypes of gender in very interesting ways. Louise Brooks, for example, in A Girl in Every Port, seems to represent the kind of Hawksian woman in a certain way already, the one who's completely self-contained, somewhat. When one speaks of arrogance in terms of Hawks, he wanted his women to be arrogant. He wanted them to present themselves as the equal or the better of any man in strength and independence and so on.
I think it's a very interesting thing to, in a certain sense, talk about the three main characters of the film, and then we can talk about the structure of the film, a bit about, I think its use of all these different locations. But before we get to the guys, as it were, let's start with Louise Brooks, because Louise Brooks is an extraordinary presence in this film, as she's an extraordinary presence in all the films she was in the late 20s, and she is a fascinating character within the history both of Hollywood and in the development of a kind of star system. So, remind us a little bit about Louise Brooks, the woman who wrote the book Lulu in Hollywood.
Well, we'll get to Lulu in a minute, yeah. But. She was a dancer, and like many women, she married a director, and she ended up in Hollywood. She was acting in the 20s, and in some ways, this is her first major role. I mean, she was in Beggars on Horseback, which was made after this. She had been in a few films before, but Hawks clearly saw something in her that perhaps others didn't. This insolence, perhaps, which is a term he used with Lauren Bacall, for example. Right. Be insolent. What's fascinating about this not only is her performance here, where she's so forward and sexual and athletic, you know, and with so much of the sense of the body we get from her, but G.W. Pabst, the German director who was casting his character of Lulu in Pandora's Box, and everyone expected Marlene Dietrich would get the role, or she expected to get it, saw A Girl in Every Port and decided that Louise Brooks was going to play his Lulu, and sought after her and lured her to Europe, where she made 2 films for him and another film for the Italian director Giannina. And really, she couldn't get back into Hollywood in the sound era, and it was a kind of a triumph and a tragedy, both.
Right. No. And of course, later in life, she was resident upstate New York, and started developing a career writing both about her own experience directly, but also about film more generally. I mean, always through her particular lens, but actually, developed a polished and intelligent style as a writer, and as I mentioned earlier, did publish a book that was a collection of her pieces called Lulu in Hollywood.
It's a very interesting book, and
yeah.
She has many opinions about everybody.
Indeed. Now let's talk about the 2 male stars, and also about this male relationship in the film. Perhaps we can start with that, because this film in a number of ways reveals a set of patterns that are going to be repeated and varied by Hawks in a number of ways. What are some of the key features of that, Bob?
Well, this is like a first tryout, and it's a little different from what comes later to a certain extent. But there is basically a triangle here, although it's set in the 2 men here are competing for women, and so the first part of the film shows how the McLaughlin character is constantly hitting on women, and then discovering that the Robert Armstrong character has been there before him and left his mark. I think the violence is an interesting aspect of it as well, because you feel as if, perhaps, thinking about later Hawks films and thinking about what we've learned about gender relationships and so on, you feel as if the violence is a kind of surrogate lovemaking or something like that. They're punching others, they're punching each other, and they, for a variety of reasons, they avow that their friendship is more important than anything else, than any woman, and there's a kind of, although it happens in the narrative and in the intertitles, the Brooks character is kind of demeaned, but you don't really feel she's being demeaned, because she's so imperturbable.
No, that's a really interesting point, I think, because of the way in which the film is structured. We have this serial competition between the 2 of them. Then we get the break, the reconciliation as friends, and then the Brooks character shows up, and all of the other women, really, one must say, they're made sort of interesting and picturesque, picturesque kinds of ways. There's an exoticism about the different ports, but they're not really given, it would even be too much to say, a personality. Whereas she not only has personality and will, but she has a sense of presence, of her physicality, that there is something at stake with her that's never quite been at stake before. I mean, it's almost as if the other women are genuinely objects almost in a sporting match, as if there's a ball being thrown back and forth. Who has possession of the football, not who has a relationship with a woman. But when she arrives, the stakes differ. And part of that is not about anything she says, and it's not anything that's imputed to the character as written, but it has very much to do with just who she is on camera and the "don't mess with me" quality.
Yeah, and there's that remarkable sequence where we watch her climbing the ladder, and there are a number of shots. She gets to the top. You know, I was trying to think about, you know, is this a stand-in? Is it a stunt woman? You know,
right.
It looks like, you know, I don't know how they shot it, but clearly, you know, we're getting the impression that she's at the top of the ladder. The dive is a special effect, but it's still very physical, that whole sequence, and it makes a huge impression. And seeing her in that kind of bodysuit, which is pretty unusual also for sort of, I mean, it's different from a bathing suit, but it's you get the full sense of her as a physical being.
Well, one of the things you were talking about a little bit earlier, I think this illustrates, and that is that she seems to be this developed Hawksian woman. One of the things that Hawks talks about in his interviews, in this very sort of light-hearted way, sort of joking way, is that he never understood why men were interested in uninteresting women. He said it just makes it, and he always used the word, it just makes everything more fun if you're with someone who is interesting and has her own self. It's I don't know if you want to call it proto-feminist or whatever, but he does have this sense that there are people out there whom he will respect, and gender's not the issue when it's somebody he finds interesting and fun, which is a word he uses to cover a lot of things that you sense in the films, but he doesn't want to detail them in language in any kind of way. One other thing I'd like to say about this is that having now talked about that second half, the first half also has in it, I think, a kind of sexuality that really is in a lot of ways adolescent, because it has to do with, I don't want to give up being a boy, but I'm attracted to girls. And I don't think this particular film, ever fully gets rid of that. I mean, you know, they are talking to one another in the very end of the film, and I think some people might even be naysayers and sort of say, guys, you just got rid of Louise Brooks here. I mean, come to your senses, you know? If you are who you say you are, maybe you should reconsider this decision. What about that idea of you know, the how shall I put it, the relative maturity of the view of gender and sexuality in this film?
It's a good question, and it's hard for me to separate it from McLaughlin as an actor, because he was, clearly he'd been a huge success in What Price Glory. There was already established this kind of military based buddy system, from the What Price Glory, which were a number of remakes and sometimes this film is seen in the Fox canon as a kind of What Price Glory offshoot,
right.
Something to keep the McLaughlin character going, and maybe it's a prejudice, but I get the feeling that he's not a Hawksian actor. He's big, he's boisterous, he's grinning, he's when you think of someone like Cary Grant or John Wayne,
Gary Cooper,
the kinds of actors whom Hawks like to use later, who are much more subdued, imperturbable, kind of have an inwardness, McLaughlin just doesn't fit that bill. I mean, he becomes a forward actor, and when he gets older and more of a character actor. But this adolescent stuff is part of it. On the other hand, it may be just one genre aspect of this era as well. That this is the way the 20s was capable, or that particular time was going to present the buddy story. you know, and the buddy story then became more complicated later. Maybe in the Depression may have had an impact or something like that.
Well, and certainly it's something that really emerges in American cinema at that moment, and you know, very much has a life today. I mean, we may or may not like its variations now, but we can see its development through Hawks's later works and something as rich, and I know both of us admire, like Only Angels Have Wings, but I mean, you go all the way forward to something like a big summer cop movie. I mean, you go to Lethal Weapon. It's that series are male bonding series, or Bad Boys. When you put two young black stars together, you use some of the same basic narrative patterns that we really see emerging here.
But it's interesting that it's hard to tell. I mean, Armstrong isn't strong enough to be to borrow a contemporary news term, to be sort of the alpha male, you know, and later when you get, you know, Grant and Thomas Mitchell, or Wayne and Clift, or Wayne and Walter Brennan, or whatever, there's a definite hierarchy in the male bonding situation. Here, it's not yet worked out yet. I mean, on the one hand, McLaughlin is the star. On the other hand, Armstrong in the narrative is the sort of the dominant figure in terms of sexual conquest.
Right.
So,
yeah. We don't have very much time left, but there's one sort of thing that also cuts across Hawks, and this comes back to what you were talking about him as beginning as a skilled writer, and that is Hawks loves to, is a master of developing motifs across a film, and they're sometimes telling, sometimes they're just joking, but he really likes patterns and how he can repeat them. Even when the thrust of his narrative might not be clear, there's always ways in which he hooks things. So we think of things like the mark that Robert Armstrong has. Or what about that pulling the finger stuff?
Pulling the finger, right. Well, there is a story about the film, since McLaughlin's character is named Spike, and you
know, we've got about 1 minute left. Well, I shouldn't have done that to you.
That's all right. But the original name of the Armstrong character was Salami, and apparently a censor board in New York decided that was carrying the motif a little bit too far, of the phallic motif, so they changed it to Bill.
Okay, we'll end on phallic motifs in Howard Hawks. If you'd like more information about City Cinematheque, drop us a line. Drop it to City Cinematheque, City University Television, 365 Fifth Avenue, New York, New York, 10016. Join us once again as we try to offer you some of the best of classic and international cinema. Thanks for joining us today.